Okay, this is our cultural anthropology project. We're obviously making a video. We each did one culture each, both of which being our fathers, and Mika's gonna go first. Yeah.
I interviewed my dad. His name's Fuamatu. I first started with, asked him if he could describe his culture that he grew up with and how did it change when he moved. He said in the Samoan culture, life was slower and they didn't have the same technologies in the States. There was very few grocery stores and only one gas station on the side of the island. Families didn't have multiple cars and buses were very important. Incomes were also significantly lower and many families relied on the lands for food. Then I asked, how old were you when you moved? Where did you move from and why did you move? And he lived in American Samoa in a small village in the Western District called Afau and moved at the age of 18 to go to college to further education and play football. Main reason a lot of people move off the island is either for military or furthering education. I then asked what were some of the most important values, norms, or behaviors of the group you grew up with. He answered first, God first. The church was very important. He grew up Catholic. And then family values and respecting your elders and those who care for you were very important as well. Some of the norms were Sunday was a day of rest. Everyone would go to church, and then there was a customary feast after church every single Sunday. That feast was called Ko'anai, and the elders and chiefs were served first because they were the most important and most respected. I asked then what were the most important norms and behaviors of the groups you belong to now. And he then answered a lot of the core values are the same, just integrated with modern distractions. The same values of sitting down with your family and connecting were still there, but technologies and opportunities like phones, movies, extracurricular activities in the States pulled everyone in different directions. I then asked, did you have any particular material objects that were important in your culture? And he answered fine mats. They were decorative mats that were hand woven from pandanus trees, decorated with colorful feathers and whatnot. Sizes of these mats would fit a twin size blanket to a queen size blanket. These fine mats were equivalent to modern day quilts. They were also a form of currency and utilized in gift giving in major life events. I asked, how did you feel about your native culture? He is very proud of his culture, and Samoans are known as the happy people, and he wears that badge proudly. He is proud of the cultural norm of respect and how to carry oneself. Then I asked him, how do you feel about the adopted culture in the States? And he feels a definite loss of culture being away from the islands, just living in modern day civilizations. And he struggles to hold on to the roots held back home in the islands. He is proud of the culture upbringing, but did not get to practice the cultural norms daily in Samoa. I asked which one he felt more identified with, and he says the Samoan one. What was the process of when you learned norms and behaviors growing up in Samoa? He said he learned growing up through family and the community. And I said, then I asked, what was the hardest thing about moving to one culture to another? And he said maintaining his own identity of culture and also adapting to modern cultures in the States without losing himself in it. I asked for advice for someone moving to the States from Samoa, and he said, take it slow, don't need to go out and mirror the surrounding culture, be proud of your roots and express it in your daily life. Being different is good, and don't forget that. He also speaks Samoan. English is taught in schools in Samoa, but the church was conducted in Samoan, and yeah, so that was my dad.
Okay, so my dad grew up in an Eastern Canadian culture. He grew up in Newfoundland. So to start, I just asked him to describe it, and he said he grew up in a small fishing community of the North Atlantic Ocean, 3 hours away from any like major town, even. There, everyone knew everyone else, and everyone could depend on the community for help when needed. And differences he noticed immediately when he moved to the U.S. were bigger cities. He couldn't do his usual hobbies like fly fishing and hunting moose. And even when he could hunt or fish, it was nowhere near the same as back home. He said people keep to themselves more in the U.S. and tend to have smaller friend circles, and it's harder to get to know people. There's far more freedom to do whatever you wanted to do in Canada rather than the U.S. He described it almost like easier to be yourself. and there was no expectation to conform to a certain standard back home, and he feels there is in the U.S. As I said earlier, he's from Canada. He moved to the U.S. when he was 22, and the reason for that is he was engaged to a American citizen who is now my mother. The most important values, norms, or behaviors that he grew up with were trust, loyalty, honesty, having each other's backs, and everyone did everything together always. And in the U.S., he said it was similar: honesty, integrity, trust, but people care about themselves far more. He said like I before we, and it was the complete opposite back home. Any important material objects, he just described the land and the ocean because where he grew up, it was a fishing community and everyone made their livelihood off the land and the ocean, whether it be from fishing and selling the fish, or killing moose and selling that meat, or picking berries and selling those. And he said the tools associated with doing those things, like rifles, fly fishing equipment, and boats and whatnot. And then I asked him, how do you feel about your native culture? And he said, although simplistic, I still feel deeply rooted in my culture. It is a large part of what makes me the person I am today. And how do you feel about your adopted culture? I then asked him. He said, I consider where I am now home, but it is very different from where I grew up. I feel like a piece of me is missing. The biggest difference is the communities and how they aren't as close as where I grew up, he said. You feel a stronger sense of identity? He said he'll always identify as Canadian because he feels like he's more of an individual that makes up a part of that community versus an individual that makes up like the American community. He's more close-knit, small community than big city individualism. When he moved to the U.S., he said that he had to blend with the shadows at first so he could learn how the culture behaved and had to adapt. He felt very alone for the first year or so living here, but then eventually got to know co-workers, and that developed into friends, and that's how he got to know people. The hardest thing he said for moving one culture to another was leaving something that is comforting and familiar and going into the unknown, starting with nothing. And finally, the advice he gave for anyone moving to a new culture, he said that there was no social media when he moved, but he thinks that would be a tremendous help to assist in getting to know people, both personally and professionally. And obviously our sources are just both our dads. Yeah. All right. Thank you.